It was 10 years ago today, 10 years ago this Saturday, that Hurricane Katrina made landfall in southeastern Louisiana. With 127-mile-an-hour winds, it was the most powerful storm to hit the U.S. in decades, and ultimately it was the costliest in American history. When the levees broke around New Orleans, about 80% of the city and surrounding areas were flooded, and in many neighborhoods it was weeks before the waters receded. More than 1,800 people were killed in the storm and its aftermath, and more than 700 people died in New Orleans alone. My guests tonight were there when Katrina hit, and although they're now both living in the Boston area, they've been following the aftermath and the lessons learned in the decades since. Joining me now are Daniel Aldrich, who had just moved to Louisiana from Boston in August 2005 and is now back here teaching political science and co-directing the Security and Resilience Studies program at Northeastern, and Dante Ramos, who was working at the Times-Picayune newspaper when the storm hit and is now an op-ed columnist at the Boston Globe. Daniel and Dante, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
So as this anniversary approaches, do you two find yourselves reliving some intensely unpleasant memories? How fresh is this stuff?
So we fled Sunday morning as the rains began to fall with our two young kids, and it was pretty intense. We had 14 hours in the car, no idea what was coming next. So looking back now, we're very grateful for the fact that we got out okay ourselves. We had neighbors who didn't survive the process, and that we've been able to survive and thrive since that point.
When you say you had neighbors who didn't survive, did you have neighbors who passed away?
We did. We had a neighbor who had a heart attack during the evacuation process, and we had just met him about 6 weeks before during our arrival in July 2005.
Dante, how fresh are the memories for you?
I have a completely different set of overly intense memories of it. I was working at the newspaper at the time and was in the newspaper building the night that the hurricane came through, and was in the city as the bowl of the city, as people down there call it, began to fill with water, and was reporting on a lot of the kind of problems with the evacuation. And for me, it was something that I saw primarily as an observer, as opposed to being from a part of town where things flooded really badly.
Dante, you went back to New Orleans recently for the Globe, and you wrote a piece taking stock of the city now. Among other things, you wrote, "Post-Katrina New Orleans offers a warning to planners everywhere. The recovery didn't reverse the old disparities. In some ways, it reinforced them." What do you mean?
There has always been a huge divide in New Orleans between black and white, between rich and poor, and those differences are literally written in the landscape of the city. And there was a brief moment after the storm where a lot of people, I would say myself included, thought that there might be some way to radically replan the city to change some of that. But it became clear pretty quickly that A, people make decisions about how to return more based on their insurance settlements than upon any grand plan, and B, that if there was some massive replanning of the city, the burden of that would fall hardest on the people who would suffer the most.
So the disparities you're talking about are still written into the geography?
Absolutely.
Daniel, if I understand it correctly, this event and your proximity to it, or your experience of it, led you to focus your academic study on how communities respond to disaster. What are some examples of discrete communities in New Orleans that either did respond effectively or didn't respond effectively, and what are the differences that account for that?
Some of the most amazing examples come from the Village de l'Est area in the northeast part of the city. There, one part of the city came back about a year and a half after the disaster. Most of us were still gathering our things together, figuring out what's going on. They brought 90% of the people back and businesses back as well. They shared together a common language. Most of them were Vietnamese or Vietnamese Americans. They had a faith in common as well. Most of them were Catholic church members. And they had a really strong cultural cohesion. They shared the belief that it was their job to fix themselves and work together to fix their community. So they were back asking for electricity to turn back on, doing things well before most of us were back in the city.
Can you point to a community that fared worse than the average New Orleans community?
Absolutely. The area of the Lower Ninth Ward has not come back. Around 2/3 or fewer of them have come back over time. A mix of reasons there. A lot of the churches and organizations in town didn't have connections outside their local organizations. Histories of racism and institutional problems in the city, corruption as well. Plus, many people had owned their homes, which was a good thing before the storm, but it meant they had no insurance. In fact, flood insurance, fewer than a fifth of the people that we talked to in our research had insurance, flood insurance against the disaster.
Dante, in your piece, you talk about some big demographic changes in the city. You say there were 40,000 young people now living in New Orleans who were not there before the storm, but also that the city has about 100,000 less African Americans than it did before the storm. I'd love to have both of you weigh in on this, as a result of those demographic changes, what has New Orleans gained, if anything, and what has it lost?
I think what you notice when you spend time in the city is that it just feels different. It feels like a qualitatively different place. The architecture is the same, the music is the same, but in some parts of it, it feels more prosperous. And if you're in the primarily unflooded, primarily white areas, it feels like a dynamic place that's on the move. On the flip side of it, there are vast areas of the cities that, as Daniel was saying, have really not come back. And the people who used to live there have really had their lives disrupted, and those wounds have not really healed.
Daniel, what do you see?
Yeah, I think you see a wider city, a wealthier city than before. A lot of people that we speak to in Houston, for example, have decided to stay there. They have better jobs. They thought the government did better things for them than the one in New Orleans. They found less corruption. The police there were treating them better. So for a number of reasons, communities that relocated to Houston have chosen to stay there. And I think that has changed the character of the city.
There was an interesting piece, you may have seen it already, by Malcolm Gladwell in the latest New Yorker, in which he tried to make the argument that some of the people who left and didn't return have actually done better because some of the social pathologies they had to grapple with in New Orleans were not dragging them down. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at that, but does that sound credible or plausible, or is it sort of typical Gladwell knee-jerk contrarianism?
It sounds plausible up to a point. There were a lot of negative dynamics that existed in some neighborhoods and in some families, and yes, to some degree, having some occasion that disrupts that could, in some abstract way, be a positive. On the other hand, sometimes there's a silver lining in a death in a family, or in, having your house burned down. You still wouldn't wish that on anybody.
Yeah. Daniel, just briefly, what is, say, one lesson that communities elsewhere in the U.S. can take from the way New Orleans rebuilt?
I think for me it was the power of networks, that rather than being a physical infrastructure question, levees or better housing, what really built communities back together was cohesion, internal working together, and a shared culture. I think a lot of us in Boston as well could benefit from that kind of approach.
All right, Daniel Aldrich, Dante Ramos, thank you both.